This is NPR News, and I'm Chris Farrell. So dealing with climate change requires new ways of doing business. I mean, how can green thinking and investments transform organizations and the national and global ecosystems that they operate in? So what's the best strategy to create more environmentally friendly business models? What are the implications of climate change for strategic investments and employments? And this is a number when I was doing my research that really struck me. Consultants at McKinsey & Company, they note that the supply chains that facilitate the production of everything from computers to cars to medicine to food support world trade in goods that is worth almost $20 trillion annually. But questions about risk and resilience of these global supply chains are being raised in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic and also climate change. So to discuss the business of the economics of sustainability, I'm joined by three guests. Dave Rappaport is the Global Social Mission Officer for Ben & Jerry's. Prior to working for the Vermont Ice Cream Company, he was Vice President of Earth and Community Care for Aveda. Thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Charlotte Band is the head of climate strategy at Qantas. Qantas guides companies to understand their climate impact and then take steps to reach goals to help meet the UN's global goal of net zero by 2050. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Daniel Esty is an environmental lawyer and policymaker, the Hill House professor at Yale University, with appointments at Yale Law School and the Yale School of the Environment, published in 2006, Green to Gold, How Smart Companies Use Environmental Strategy to Innovate, Create Value, and Build Competitive Advantage. So thanks for being here.
Chris, it's a pleasure.
And for those of you who are joining this webinar, please put as many questions as you have in the question button, and we'll try to get as many questions as we can. And Danny, I want to start off with you. You described the challenge of sustainability as a business megatrend. All right. So what do you mean by that?
So I think there are, in any business, issues that come along, challenges that the company faces that you must address. So in recent years, there was the information technology revolution, and every business had to figure out how to become adept at online sales and managing in an information technology world. And I'm arguing that going forward, sustainability broadly, climate change in particular, is just that sort of megatrend. Everybody in business is going to have to learn to deal with it. Those who manage the issue well are going to succeed and outperform their competitors. So it really is a defining feature of business life going forward from here, and frankly, a determinant factor of which companies will be the winners and which will fall by the wayside.
So what are some of the lessons of history when we're thinking about this kind of a shift? Because a lot of the discussion, as you know, about sustainability, climate change is focused on the costs, how expensive this is going to be. And when you're talking about, this is actually an investment.
So I think it's an investment, and it's frankly an imperative. It's an element of strategy you can't get away from. And what I would argue is that every company needs to, and this is, of course, led by the management team, probably by the CEO, in fact. And the research of my team at Yale has found that a couple of things are critical. One is you have to have a vision and a strategy of where you're going. So you've got to know what these issues are, how they affect you and your industry, where you play against the issues, what are your strengths, your weaknesses, and that kind of vision of, particularly in the case of climate change, a decarbonized future has to become a defining element of your corporate strategy. And then, frankly, the other thing we've found is that a strategy is not enough. You've got to actually have an execution plan. You've got to implement against that strategy. And those elements are fundamental. And, in my work, Chris, you mentioned the Green to Gold book. And in that book, I lay out with my co-author, Andrew Winston, a number of elements of what companies need to do to make strategy work around sustainability. And one is to think about it as a way to reduce risk. Another is a way to reduce cost. Another is a way to drive revenue. And finally, it's a way to build your brand and your identity with your customers. And all of those need to be part of this strategy that you're building and then delivering through careful implementation.
And Charlotte, I'm
And Dan,
curious.
if I could jump
No,
in,
please.
I just add this notion of it being a business imperative is ever increasing, and I think that in particular what we're seeing is that millennials and especially Gen Z are demanding that their values be reflected in the products that they buy and also in the places that they work. And so it becomes an even more important business imperative when viewed from that lens.
And so, Charlotte, I'm curious, terms like decarbonization that we hear, the science of sustainability, the science of climate change. How do you translate that into with senior leadership when they're talking about their cash flow, headcount, all the kind of business strategy issues that are very important to a business? So how do you make that translation or that connection?
Thanks. That's a great question, I think. And to both points that have been made right now, I think it's about broadening the topic and not talking just about cost. I think it's about talking around value. And when we're talking about the science of sustainability, we're really trying to understand what it is that we have in front of us. Where are we going in terms of climate and other environmental issues? And so this is what will define the future landscape of the corporate markets and financial markets and how they will need to adapt to this from a risk standpoint. But it also brings the question of values and like how do you drive value with your company? And it goes way beyond cost. It goes through innovation. It goes through how you can bring more talents on board and really get their buy-in into your company and into your products. And this is how you get buy-in, really going above cost and shifting from it will be a short-term investment, but it will bring benefits in the mid-long term that will go way beyond the financial elements, and it's good for your business. And just a thing that I wanted to add is that unfortunately, I think we don't have enough of these discussions nowadays with the leadership. We're still seeing a lot of discussions around sustainability happening at the sustainability department level and not enough really at the business strategy and the corporate strategy level.
And you've used a term that you like the term climate justice. Why is that?
I think climate justice is a new term that, first of all, is hard to describe and to define, and I think it would deserve a better definition in the long term. But it's really the notion that we need to be first very careful on how we go at this transition to make sure that we don't lead to social impacts throughout this transition, as well as right now we're facing, and we know that emerging and poorest populations will suffer from climate change consequences in a more drastic manner. And so it is our way of behaving that will lead to impacts that are happening elsewhere. And so it's really important that we start thinking and taking our own responsibility to make sure that we bring justice and we ensure that the climate transition brings also a better social component in the future for the populations at hand.
Yeah. And Dave, I want to ask you about global supply chains. So when I, was writing business journalism and you had the, global supply chains were really fascinating, but it was always a story about efficiency, just in time. Companies, building, supplying thousands and thousands of goods and services all over the world. Sustainability didn't really enter that conversation.
Well, from a climate perspective, for many of us in most businesses, the majority of the carbon is not within our walls, but in our value chain. And I think in particular for companies in the food business, it's mostly upstream. So for example, at Ben & Jerry's, we know that almost 3/4 of our greenhouse gas emissions are in the ingredients, in the production of the ingredients that we use. Just over half from dairy and just under 1/4 from other ingredients. And so that's where we're focused because that's where the carbon is and that's what we have to get a handle on. The emissions from our manufacturing is actually only 1% of our carbon footprint.
So how do you track it? How do you measure it? I mean, I don't know how many suppliers you have, but you're not a tiny company and you're part of Unilever, which is a giant multinational corporation. So I would imagine there's lots of people that want to do business with you.
Well, absolutely. We do have a fair number of suppliers, but by looking at the science, it's not that difficult to begin to see where the majority of carbon is. And as I mentioned, over half of it is from dairy farming. And you can't really go out there and actually measure it, but there's been plenty of work done to understand in broad terms, the quantity of emissions from different types of agricultural practices. We know, on a dairy farm, about 47% of the emissions are the actual, what are called enteric emissions, the burping of the cows, methane that's produced in digestion. We know that the next biggest group or source is from manure, methane generated by the cow manure, and then just under 20% is from the feed cropping. And so our efforts are focused in those three areas on dairy. And likewise, with other ingredients, we're looking at the sources of emissions and the production of those ingredients. And also, from a climate justice perspective, the ways in which we can have an impact in those communities. As Charlotte said, the greatest impacts of climate change are already being felt in marginalized communities, both here in the U.S. and around the world. And so doing interventions that address carbon at the same time as increasing livelihoods, making improvements in the lives of women and girls, for example, are things that really can be done at once with the same measures if you take a comprehensive approach. And so a lot of our focus is in that area as well.
And Dan, a question for you, and Charlotte, I'd be curious what you think. I was at this presentation, and it was a multinational corporation, and they had a division that was really doing real sustainability work. I mean, the product, the customer base, the investment, so impressive. Happen to know that they had other divisions where sustainability wasn't even on the radar screen. The only thing was cost. And so this issue of you have companies with diverse divisions, and one division can be highly sustainable, but the rest of the company, that's just not what they're going to get rewarded on. That's not what management bonuses are based on. Dan?
So I would say you've picked up one of the issues that's made the challenge of being a chief sustainability officer or being any corporate leader where sustainability has become an important lens through which people are judged. And you've brought that into sharp focus. And I would call that a problem of misalignment. You've got some elements of the business that are supporting the push towards a sustainable future. And that can be very attractive to customers. It can be attractive, again, in critical stakeholder groups that people now have to reach out to. Dave mentioned employees. You want to go to work for a company that they don't think is on the right side of the big issues of the day. Sustainability being very much front and center for that younger generation. And if you've got a business that's kind of misaligned, some pieces in the right place, some not, very hard to sell that to the young people. And I think it's going to increasingly be the case that investors don't want to have that complexity. They want to see an aligned structure and a company that's positioned to be a leader going towards a sustainable future and, frankly, ready to be a profitable business in that world ahead. And that's why I think there's so much interest now in sustainable investing. You talk about metrics, Dave. Well, I guess Dave did, but Chris, you were raising the question. And, there's a big focus now on what are known as ESG metrics, environmental, social, and governance gauges of corporate performance. And it's not going to come out looking that good if you're in one division doing well, but in another not so well. That adds up to a mediocre record at best. So I do think companies are under pressure to rethink their business models, to push toward a sustainable future, and really be seen as helping society address this overarching challenge of climate change in particular, sustainability more broadly. And those that are in alignment with that direction of the world, direction of society, direction that so many critical stakeholders want to go, are likely to find traction in the marketplace and success. And those that are even partly misaligned face real challenges.
Charlotte?
Yeah, first of all, I want to say that I agree with everything that's been said. I think it's spot on. I think that question of misalignment is also becoming more and more visible, and I think it also comes and reflects the fact that sustainability strategies are still very siloed, as I was mentioning earlier. So we often see sustainability strategies as defined by a certain team, and then the business strategy defined by another one. And in that case, the sustainability strategy becomes much more about optimizing your business as usual and optimizing your business strategy to be more sustainable rather than having an actual corporate strategy that is sustainable. And once we'll be able to move towards thinking around how is your business going to be shifting towards sustainable practices embedded in every piece of your business, and how is your business going to be sustainable in the future, then these will not happen anymore, because the entire guidance of the company will be about sustainability or embedded sustainability, rather than having something on the side that in any case will tackle the easiest spots first. And that's natural in the business. You will go and look for quick wins and low-hanging fruits. And that's, I think, what we're seeing right now with sustainability strategies being siloed and separate from business strategies in many cases.
Dave, I see you nodding.
Yeah, I know it's so important to ensure that the alignment occurs through the KPIs that people are working toward to achieve their goals. It's got to be wrapped into their compensation and all of the expectations. I think that it's critical that there be a commitment from the top. But often, even if there is a conceptual commitment at the top of a company, it takes a while on the learning curve for senior executives to understand that they have to really get that alignment throughout the company at that KPI level. And I've seen that evolve in several of the places that I've worked over time, where you have a company that has some very aggressive goals around sustainability, but the folks in procurement haven't gotten that memo yet, and they're still being compensated in traditional ways. But over time, I think that's increasingly changing. That's the way you get everybody in a company to embrace those goals and to really make it part of their day-to-day work. It's not the question is not whether somebody's personally passionate about this stuff. I think anybody who's sort of alive and looking around at the world realizes that we need to get to work on this stuff. But we all obviously also are focused on the tasks at hand, and so it's important that they be organized well and aligned around these broad and obviously critical goals.
And for our non-business viewers, yep, just what
could I just add
yeah, I just want to get a definition, KPI, for our non-business viewers.
Key performance indicators.
Thank you. Dan, sorry.
So I just wanted to add that I think part of the challenge that Dave's describing, and Charlotte as well, is that companies are also these days subject to enormous demands of transparency. So it's very hard to spin up a story and blow smoke in the way it might have been okay to do a few years back. It's really now not only unacceptable to be doing greenwashing, but impossible to sustain. And companies are finding that someone's going to ask the hard questions. And by the way, it might be that they're doing well on environmental issues, but not on social issues. And that will come out as well. So this is a tough challenge. I like to say to business leaders, this is probably the hardest issue that they will face because it's got so many dimensions, so many facets. And frankly, the goalposts are moving. What good performance looks like is going to be harder to achieve next year than it was last year. And so there's a lot to be done to stay on top of the sustainability agenda.
Yeah. Now I want to go to one of our viewers. Geraldine asks, what approach would you recommend that governments, cities, counties, et cetera, take? I mean, what strategy should they emphasize? And I know we're talking about the business side of things, but still, government can help set that framework. Charlotte?
Yeah, I think, the first thing is that we will not achieve this with only businesses working towards that goal. So it's a very valid question when we're thinking, more holistically at governments, but also consumers, like what the role of everybody has to be in achieving this goal. And I think what governments can do for sure, and I would like to get also Dan's opinion on this, especially with your background, is really going towards policies that incentivize actions in the right direction. We're still seeing too many policies that, incentivize fossil fuels consumption, and that like there are a lot of policies that currently are not helping businesses that want to go into the right direction do so. And the second thing when it comes to government is that we need to make sure that the policies that are deployed are actually something that that incentivize in the right way all different types of businesses. We're not just looking at the big corporations here. We're looking at all the different businesses that are on the spectrum. And it's important to think about the smaller suppliers as well, or the smaller companies, and how we can equip them to make that transition.
Dan?
So I will jump in if you want. Which,
yes, please.
I did spend a number of years as the head of Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. So I feel like I've had the luxury of looking at the challenge business faces from both inside businesses, working with them, and then from the policy perspective of how does government induce businesses to be sustainability leaders and help ensure that they are not sustainability laggards. And I actually think it's a pretty similar model or strategy as to what a company has to do. A government needs a vision, it needs a strategy, and then it needs an execution plan. It needs to implement. And then, frankly, beyond that, it needs to track performance. It needs to have metrics. It needs to see how it's doing and be prepared to refine its strategy depending on whether what it's doing is working or not. And I think that's really critical in both business and government. It's almost impossible, given the complexity of this agenda, to get it all right in the first instance. So you have to understand it as a journey, as something that's going to require work and frankly, rethinking and refinement over time. And I do think Charlotte has it just right in laying out some of those elements about incentives. This is, again, where government really has its critical role. The government gets to set the rules of the marketplace, the rules for participation in society. And in doing so, it helps to set out the incentives. And from my point of view, there's two big incentives that government should focus on. One is to induce companies to invest in sustainability. And I think the best way to do that, by the way, is to penalize them, make them pay if they're not sustainably performing, if they're causing pollution, if they're releasing greenhouse gas emissions. So I do think the incentives for investment in sustainable strategies and production and sustainable products is critical. And beyond that, or perhaps critical to the movement towards a sustainable future, is innovation. So I think it's critical for government to set out a strategy for business that rewards those who think in new and different and fresh ways. When you look at what, Ben and Jerry's is a great example. What an innovative company. They transformed what we thought of as ice cream and thought of as what companies can do while selling ice cream. And, that's carried the day with many folks, including the children in my house. So, it is really important to see how innovation is, in my mind, the critical virtue that gets us to the sustainable future that we're talking about.
And I do want to talk some more about innovation, but Dave, I want to get your thoughts about this question on government.
Yeah. Well, I'll just add that I think that in addition to the things that Dan has been mentioning, it's also true that these are not problems that individuals in themselves. We need to have in place in which we operate that enable us to be doing these things. So incentives are a part of that. The creation of the right kinds of infrastructure and other systemic issues are things that really we can only do that together, and that means government has to be involved. And so I think that that's not something to be overlooked. And from a business point of view, what that means is that businesses have to start caring about and engaging in influencing public policy toward these measures with the same vigor, with the same level of resources that they currently devote to things like tax policy and the traditional ways in which businesses get involved with what they call government affairs. Businesses have to turn the tide and get government to actually do the things that we all need to be doing together in order to solve these problems.
And Charlotte, a word that's come up a lot is metrics. So define metrics for us. I mean, what does that really mean? And how good are the metrics?
That's a tricky one. I think so metrics are basically any kind of way to measure something. So typically when we talk about climate change, one of the major metrics we're going to be using is called carbon equivalence. So it's looking at how all the different greenhouse gases emissions will impact climate. And so that's a metric we use to measure the impact that companies, governments, individuals have on climate. Now, to the point on how good are the metrics, I would say they are better than they used to be, but they're not perfect, and we need to accept that. And it's hard sometimes, especially, I work in a company with a lot of scientists, so it is, sometimes difficult to come to terms with the fact that the data is going to be sometimes imperfect or sometimes too generic. We will have a country level information and maybe not have, the specific practices for each farm, as Dave was mentioning earlier for Ben and Jerry's. However, the data, I would say, is good enough to make decisions and to help us make progress on the major challenges that we are facing. We've been working on climate for quite some time now, so other topics are a bit more difficult to tackle nowadays when it comes to metrics. Biodiversity, for instance, is much harder, or I would say newer in the science. But on climate, we have a lot of data that already enables us to make very sound decisions. And to innovate, to the point that Dan made, I think innovation is going to be the key success drivers for companies that will be around with us in the future. And having that innovation be based on sound scientific metrics will really enable to make it successful.
And Dan, your book came out in 2006, and I think, as you mentioned, or it was really got some focus in 2007, 2008. So when you look at that period of time to now, where we are today, how much progress do you feel there has been made when it's about the data, the metrics, the measurements that we're using?
So I think there has been a lot of progress made, and I think the world has actually dramatically changed in the intervening decade and a half since Green to Gold first came out. In fact, I had to write a sequel a couple of years later because the world had changed so much. And I think one of the things that has changed is the attitude of business towards the environment, towards sustainability broadly, including the social dimensions. And I think 15 years ago, I spent a lot of time convincing corporate leaders, talking to boards, talking to CEOs and leadership teams about why they needed to bring sustainability into strategy. And today, I can tell you, I don't spend very much time on that at all. Today, boards want to know how. How do we do it? How do we make it pay off? And by the way, it doesn't always pay off. You've got to do your sustainability strategy, as anyone in the business world, including I'm sure Charlotte and Dave could tell you, in a thoughtful, careful, analytically rigorous, business-like way. And if you throw money at crazy things, it will not pay off. But I do think today the question is, how do you make it work? How do you make sure that it puts you in a place for competitive opportunity, competitive advantage? But I think maybe most fundamentally, and Chris, this is really a change that's come on in the last couple of years, I think the business community has come to understand that the foundations of the corporate role in society are changing. And in short, it is no longer okay to have a company make private gains at public expense. And whether that's putting pollution up a smokestack or greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, in effect, you're putting onto society a cost that might otherwise have had to have been borne by your business. And if that's how you're getting your profits, it's not a good business model. And frankly, that's going to be caught out in the next few years. And I think the corporate world gets this now. The largest CEOs of the companies in America, the Business Roundtable, have changed their understanding of corporate purpose. They have said the era of shareholder primacy, where the entire goal of business was to make money, is in the past. That's the Milton Friedman history. Going forward, we have stakeholder responsibility. In that regard, companies owe a duty of care to their employees, to their customers, to their suppliers, to the communities they operate in, and frankly, to society more broadly. And that really does redefine corporate purpose, corporate mission, and companies that are not thinking about that shifting ground on which corporate success has to be built are at further risk.
So, Dave, does that resonate with you?
To that.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think adding to that, not only is it about an increased sense of responsibility, but the big watchword now in business is this idea of purpose. I think the business world is waking up to the idea that we all have to have, we all as human beings already have a sense of purpose beyond making money. And businesses that are going to be successful in the future are going to be the businesses that actually have a real sense of purpose beyond that their purpose is going to attract the best employees and retain them. It's going to attract their customers. And it's really about how can that business in its own way be a force for good. Ben and Jerry's would not exist if Ben and Jerry hadn't figured out a way to make Ben and Jerry's a true force for good, to use Ben and Jerry's to change the nature of business and to be a force for social justice, economic justice, and environmental protection and regeneration. And so that's very much integrated into our business. Our business is driven by this social mission along with our product and financial missions, and they really intertwine to create the business success that we have. We don't do the social mission that I lead and that really everybody in the company is engaged with for the instrumental purpose of building the business to sell more ice cream. But we do know that that's a happy byproduct of it. We know that that's a major factor in why people want to come to work with us. We know that people who are aware of these things buy more ice cream. So this is going to be increasingly a critical factor in every business's success, finding out what that means for them and how they can do that. While there are robust business models for all this stuff, the primary driver in the future is not going to be that, but it's going to be about having that greater sense of what true corporate citizenship is and a sense of purpose beyond what we've been awash in from Milton Friedman for so many years.
Yeah. So, and this is a question for all three of you, and I'll start with you, Charlotte. So we've gone through a global pandemic, and from the business point of view, are there lessons that you're drawing from the global pandemic that apply to climate change, which is, again, another huge risk that we're dealing with? Charlotte?
Yeah, and I think you nailed it well at the end, which is actually the risk of disruption. I think this is what we've seen companies realize is what does an actual risk of massive disruption in your business could climate change look like? And so if you're looking at the COVID pandemic, we see how quickly companies have managed to adapt, but also how painful it's been for them to have to adapt in such a short time frame. And they realized going through this pandemic that this could be very much reflective of other types of climate change related risks that might happen in the future to their company. And therefore, they also realized that if there is a way to avoid that very painful adaptation to take place in a very short amount of time, but kind of build resilience over time to be in a situation when that next risk is going to happen, because it will, that next event will take place, that they are ready for it and that they are in a situation where they will go much more smoothly through it. And the data has shown it as well. I mean, if we're looking at the stock markets, you can see on the stock markets that companies who have strong ESG, as Dan was mentioning, so environmental, social, and governance strategies have tended to outperform other companies during the COVID pandemic. So it has really brought to light the benefits, even on the financial side of things, of being more resilient, having looked at your environmental and social elements and have built strong strategies around these. And we've really seen a shift. I mean, entering the pandemic, where I think we were all concerned a little bit in the sustainability space of how is this going to, lead in terms of sustainability? Will we see sustainability goals being dropped or just put on the side? And while we're seeing a challenge around investment because cash can be short in some of the companies, we're seeing a doubling in efforts in terms of making strategies in place, putting goals out there, really understanding that this has to be core in this company for it to survive in the future economy.
And Dan, and I'd also read, if you go back and you look at the first oil crisis or the original oil crisis, and that really had reverberations over the years on how businesses managed their business. And I'm wondering whether when it's coming to COVID, will that have implications for how businesses manages with the thought about the risk of climate change?
I think Charlotte's, put the word out there that I think is central here, and it's resilience. I think what we've seen is that companies have learned that the world doesn't unfold in ways that the plan might have suggested it would. And the key is not it doesn't mean you shouldn't have a plan, but it means you've got to have a plan that's robust against change. And I think that's what companies are seeing. And the same applies to climate change. You need to have a plan. You need to see how you're going to get to the clean energy future that's coming. And you've got to be ready to shift and adjust that plan as circumstances demand. And I think a lot of companies that were kind of moving slowly on this issue of decarbonization a few years ago have had to pick up their pace. Their test now is, can they catch up with the fast-moving change that's sweeping across society, frankly, around the world, not just in the United States. And I do think resilience is kind of the core frame that a lot of folks are finding useful in this regard.
Dave?
Well, I think certainly what's been said already is very true. I think it's also the case that the COVID pandemic has been this amazing moment when everybody has sort of thought more about what really matters. And that's part of what's going on here in motivating change and in the change that Charlotte mentioned. One measure of it is that I've never seen so many job postings for chief sustainability officers and similar kinds of positions. Businesses are really are doubling down their investment in this stuff. And I think the other part of it, as has already been said, is that we got a lesson in what disruption really looks like. And when you take a look at the climate chaos that's ahead of us, even if we do everything right over the next several decades and bring emissions down to holding global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, there's very few businesses that are going to benefit from that disruption. Whether it is the places where you have been sourcing ingredients can no longer grow them, whether it is the humanitarian issues that will drive increased migration and civil unrest and economic disparity. None of those things are good for business. And so we're all seeing a little bit of that, a little window into some of that through COVID. And I think that businesses are by and large, beginning to get the point. However, it needs to be said that as much as we've made progress in our thinking in new ways now, we are not right now headed in the right direction. I mean, we're nowhere, or at least we're nowhere near where we need to get. We are headed toward a level of climate disruption that we'll be lucky to survive, let alone thrive in. And so we do need to continue to think about how we do something very drastically different than what we've done before.
So Charlotte, when we're thinking about, doing something drastically different than we've done before, what are you watching? I mean, what are you, for the time horizon of like 5 years? And when you're talking to businesses, business leaders, what are you watching?
Yeah, I think when we're looking at the time horizon of 5 years, unfortunately, that's where a lot of companies still have a lot of options in their business as usual setup. So the reality is that there's still a lot that can be done without really rethinking the business model. And what we're trying to do is to shift the conversation by saying, yes, all of this needs to be done today. So go ahead with all these low-hanging fruits. But in parallel, really try and understand, what does your business model looks like in 10, 15, 20 years when you will need to have achieved not 20 or 40 or 50% reductions, but actually a 90% reductions in your impact? What does that look like? How can you really go towards that business model transformation?
And what is the response? I mean, what did then, if you're saying that and I'm the CEO of company X, I mean, what is the typical response that you're going to get?
I think for now, there's still a little bit of shyness towards these ideas. I think to what I believe it was Dan who mentioned it earlier, like the shareholders versus stakeholders elements, while it is something that is really that companies really want to do. The reality is that shareholders, especially in investor-driven companies, are still very strong. And we've seen it lately with still a lot of CEOs that do not have the space to make these decisions because they have to turn on short-term profits. So what we're working with the CEOs and the C-suite levels that we're talking with is about understanding how we can equip them to be the courageous leaders that will stand in front of their shareholders and stand their grounds by saying, this is what will make sense for our company to even survive in the mid-long term. And this requires courageous leadership, and it's not easy. And we need to understand that they're facing very difficult barriers. And so it will require a systemic change that sometimes goes beyond the CEOs themselves to be able to make these transformations. So I would say the answer is that they agree, but they're not sure how to go at it.
And Dan, so do you have do you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I was just going to
Yes.
say, I think, Charlotte's really hit the nail on the head in one of the big challenges, and that is that in a world of imperfect regulation, and we certainly have incomplete and imperfect regulation, it may be that the companies that are polluting will be more profitable. So it does require over time that governments get better at chasing down the harms that companies are imposing on society. And that's why I've been arguing for an end to externalities as the kind of basic framework for government. And I do think sustainability is a joint venture. It involves behavioral change by all of us. It requires corporate strategies, and it requires a government framework. So I do think all of these pieces have to come together. And before we get to that point, frankly, there will be CEOs who run out in front of what the market is willing to support, and they will get their proverbial heads chopped off. We've seen it recently with Danone, where a CEO was out in front of his industry and his stock performance was subpar, and he did not survive. Frankly, and I will say this with some trepidation in front of Dave, but Unilever faced a threat of a similar sort a few years back, where Paul Polman, the iconic sustainability leader, by the way, who's writing a book in the title is something about courageous companies. And I think that's coming out later this year. But he nearly lost his job as there was a takeover threat, while Unilever was in some small way underperforming against stock market expectations. And there are, an ongoing list of companies that got too far out in front of the market. So I think there is an important gauge one has to watch, which is how far can I push? How courageous can I be, recognizing, especially if you're in a public company, the constraints of the marketplace, and those shareholders remain. By the way, as we talk about, critical stakeholders, they are a stakeholder. They're a critical stakeholder. So you can't simply perform for the benefit of your employees or your communities. You've still got to watch out and make sure you're delivering the goods in a perspective that the stakeholders, including the shareholders, will find attractive.
Dave?
Boy, not much to add. I mean, I think that's very true. And certainly those pressures are real. Change is not easy. Change is not comfortable. It does take courage. And somehow we have to find that to be able to do the things that we need to do to thrive. And I think there'll be a lot of learning along the way. But again, I think this also gets back to the systemic change element. It can't just be all about what these courageous CEOs are willing to say to their shareholders. We've got to look for the structural and regulatory changes that will enable that. And that's where we all have to work together. And that's, again, where companies have to really dedicate themselves to having that kind of a constructive impact on public policy.
So, Dan, are there examples from history that might shed light on this kind of transformation for business leaders to be, filtering the information that you all have been talking about, and with their understandable skepticism, right, in terms of thinking about profits and investment and money and all that? But are there periods of history where there's some lessons that we should keep in mind?
So I have spent a fair bit of time studying and with a team at Yale analyzing these kind of transformational moments in business history. And I do think what you can find is that there are mega trends. We talked about the sustainability imperative as a mega trend. And there are other trends in the past kind of corporate world history. I mentioned information technology. Quality in the manufacturing sector was another of these transformational trends. And if you were a business leader and you didn't figure it out and your management team didn't develop a strategy, history kind of left you behind and your business fell by the wayside. And by the way, we've seen this in old-time manufacturing and high tech as well. For some of us, the first computer we worked on was a Wang. Well, that company is totally gone. And frankly, the next one up that was pretty exciting was the DEC, the digital equipment, totally gone. So it does show that corporations can be flying high at one moment, but if they don't keep pace with the transformations required by society, by the circumstances that we all live in, they can fall by the wayside very quickly. And I think sustainability has emerged as just that sort of kind of watershed moment for society and as a result for the corporate community. And I do see companies that are stepping up to the challenge, that are thinking hard, that are delivering transformative change. You know, you can say what you will about Elon Musk, and there's a lot to be said, but he has been transformative.
That's another hour.
That's another whole hour, but probably will get higher ratings than the one we've just been through. But, you know, Elon Musk is transformative in a way that Steve Jobs was transformative. In both cases, they helped get people to think about something they didn't even know they needed or wanted before they had the imagination of what that might be. And I think it is that kind of leadership that is going to be part of our pathway to a sustainable future. So I'm looking out at a number of CEOs who are stepping up to the challenge, who've committed themselves to really fundamentally shifting the foundations of their business, of their industry. I'm looking at the new leadership of BP, a company that's now committed to transformation. Or you could look at Equinor, once the old state oil company of Norway. They have really changed themselves into an energy company, not an oil company, and they're now leading the way towards a clean energy future with huge investments in offshore wind and renewable power more broadly. So I think you've got some of the folks in the corporate world seeing this sustainability imperative for what it is and trying to shift gears in their own company to make sure that their business stays out in front of the wave that's coming.
And Charlotte, are there, historic examples or examples drawn from history that when you're having conversations with business leaders or their employees that help bring what needs to be done alive?
I'm not sure these are really historic examples, but rather, I think, exemplary companies that we've seen, throughout the years achieve that. I think when I'm talking with businesses and especially C-suite levels, they're more interested in concrete examples that it can be done and that your company can actually succeed through such a transformation that is led by sustainability. And in that sense, I think two examples that come to mind. The first one is Interface. I think it's well known to a lot of people, but it basically really transformed its entire business model to be more sustainable, and it has thrived from this. A couple other examples that we see, one is a Belgian company. I'm originally from Belgium and working a lot across Europe as well, so a lot of my references are often Europeans as well. But is Umicore. Umicore used to be in a heavy industry setup, and they completely transformed their business model throughout circular economy to use waste as a primary source of materials. And now they are thriving, and they were close to like a bad financial situation before that transition. And so these are concrete examples that talk to the businesses when I'm explaining those. And it's more what I tend to rely on as pragmatic examples for them to get inspired.
Yep. And Dave, do a lot of companies or managements or people come to Ben & Jerry's to sort of ask you, okay, how are you doing this?
Well, certainly in this age of the webinar, I found myself having a lot of these kinds of conversations, which has been fun. How we do it is not really a story of any particular sort of set of innovations. It is just this idea, a different idea of what business could be. At a very basic level. There's a story that when Ben and Jerry actually took an ice cream correspondence course and created their first scoop shop in an old converted gas station in Burlington, Vermont. And they did it because they liked to eat and they wanted to hang out together. After about 3 years, they were doing all the stuff that you have to do to keep a business going, and it wasn't so much fun anymore. And Ben was getting tired of it, and he was going to sell the company. And he had a mentor at the time who, he was talking to, complaining about this too. And he said, Ben, if you don't like the way the business is, why don't you just change it? And that got Ben to thinking about what the potential of this really was to be an expression of who he wanted to be in the world and the change he wanted to see in the world. And so that's why it really is true that if they hadn't found a way to make Ben and Jerry's that force for good in the world, they would have sold it. It wouldn't exist anymore. And it's simply that realization and all that it has led to, this idea of linked prosperity, ensuring that everybody involved in our value chain are benefiting from their engagement with this business, from everything from living wages up through other ways to improve their livelihoods and climate resilience and all of the social justice work that we do. That's been this driving force that turns out is appealing to people, and it's a part of our business success. But part of the magic is that we realize that we did it for that purpose. We lose it. We lose the magic. It has to be authentic. And so this notion of digging in to really be authentic to make the change you want to see in the world, or to do any of these things that we're talking about, the Gen Z generation has really highly refined BS detectors, and they're going to know, and you're not going to survive very well if you're not doing this stuff with authenticity. It doesn't mean you always get it right, but it means that you're genuinely trying and owning up to your mistakes and then continuing to move forward. And I think people reward you for that much more so than papering over things or just trying to jump on a trend, to say what do our customers value and how can we align ourselves with that, as opposed to saying what do we value and how do we advance that in the world. So these are things that I think are really critical to making the progress we've been talking about here.
So what would you like to see Ben and Jerry's do next? I mean, through the lens of sustainability, what's the next ambition?
Well, we've got to do two things. We've got to drastically reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and other impacts of our ingredients, foremost dairy. And we think that over the next decade, we can reduce the carbon emissions from dairy by at least half. And then the other thing we have to do is sell a lot more non-dairy euphoria. We know that we're not going to hit our carbon goals by staying primarily a dairy company. That doesn't mean we're going to get away from ice cream. We're going to make the best ice cream possible. And as I said, we're drastically reduce the carbon footprint, but an increasing percentage of our overall portfolio has to come from less carbon intensive ingredients. And so those are the key things that we're now working on.
And one of the things I wanted to ask you, Charlotte, is what about smaller businesses? I mean, a lot of the ESG conversation, for understandable reasons, is about large publicly traded corporations. And it's very much of a stock market, bond market perspective. So in this conversation about corporate transformation, business transformation, the role of smaller businesses. Oh, there we go. We don't.
Sorry, I was muted. The good old habits of muting yourself for background noises. I was saying that small companies and small businesses have a huge role to play in that transition. And I think what's important is for them to find the balance, because if you ask small companies to go throughout the lens of reporting that big companies are going through, or like really have this kind of level of reporting and so on, we're going to lose them by spending so much time on doing paperwork rather than acting. But the strength of smaller businesses is that they're more agile, they can move more quickly, and they can also, if they're a small business that's growing really fast, they can build up from the start a much more sustainable business. And they don't have to transform as much as they have to really start in a more sustainable manner. So I think there's a lot of potential that is currently not tapped on and tends to be overlooked when it comes to small businesses. And I'm lucky enough to work with a few of these throughout Qantas, and it's just beautiful to see because of how quickly they can shift. And sometimes it does bring challenges. You know, if they're too small to source some more sustainable materials or to access some pieces of the markets. But that's where also the importance of partnerships come into play. And we've been lucky to witness a few partnerships amongst different brands, small and bigger, that have worked together to create absolutely amazing innovations.
And Dan, same question to you about smaller businesses and the role of smaller businesses with sustainability.
So I think there are real reasons that small businesses want to track the trend and try to stay with the sustainability imperative to the greatest extent possible. And I do think, since innovation has been identified by all of us today as critical to the sustainable future, it is sometimes the case that the small businesses are quicker, more nimble, and more innovative. And so I do think there are potential opportunities for the small business. There are challenges, as Charlotte's indicated. There are some aspects of this sustainability agenda that require capital investments. They may be less well positioned to make those investments. But I also think that there are growing realities. Dave mentioned authenticity. I think it's true. I think, for example, one of the burdens is a sustainability program that's all about filling out forms of disclosure. And I think it turns out there's big differences between disclosure and transparency. And disclosure is about filling out the form, sometimes even kind of taking the form and twisting it in your own direction. Transparency is really about sharing with the world who you are, authentically who you are. And as Dave indicated, sometimes it means laying out your vision, your strategy, and you don't hit the target, you miss. But if people get the sense you're going in the right direction, I think they find that more acceptable and frankly more honest than somebody who's blowing a lot of smoke, telling a greenwash story, and reporting in a way that looks good, but when you dig beneath the surface really isn't there. And I do think there is a tendency, not always true, but a tendency for the small businesses to be more authentic, often because they do have an owner leader who brought to the whole enterprise some passion that comes through and gives them a kind of a market-leading opportunity because of that passion. And again, it's one of the core words of the day, and that is purpose. It gives them a sense of purpose, and that sense of purpose energizes customers, energizes employees, and if managed right, can help be a driver of innovation.
So as we're getting near the end, totally unfair question. And I'll start with you, Charlotte. Looking over the next 30 years, how do you think business will have changed through this lens of sustainability, through the lens of climate change, both how you sort of putting on your science hat, how you think it will have changed, but also putting on your aspirational hat, how you would like it to have changed?
Yeah, I think from the science hat, it's also an aspirational hat, though, but it's the fact that businesses would have integrated science at the core of their business strategy, and that it becomes a fundamental of when they're setting their business strategy to include what we call planetary boundaries. And planetary boundaries, just in a couple words, are what are the limits of the planet in which humanity can keep thriving. And once we understand that and we have a company that operates within those planetary boundaries, we are in what we call a sustainable state from an environmental standpoint. And I think that there is everything out there to make this happen. I'm actually very optimistic thanks to innovation that we're seeing and the shift of pace that we're seeing, that even though we are behind, there's a lot that can be achieved in the next decade to get us in the right direction. We need to do more, but what makes me hopeful is that it's feasible to achieve that. So we'll have big leaders that have drastically reduced and transformed their businesses alongside using science as a reference. And we'll have we won't be able to call laggards anymore, I think would be my aspirational goal, is that we don't have any companies anymore that are on the side, not really doing anything and kind of like letting the leaders speak and them hiding in the shadows. My aspirational goal is to have every single company be on that journey.
Dave?
Well, I think in 30 years, my hope and expectation actually is that businesses will no longer operate in this world that's divorced from all the rest of our human aspirations to make the world a better place, to help other people, where we're just somehow supposed to leave all that stuff at the door when we go to work and do it in our spare time. That business will embrace their role of helping to realize those essentially human aspirations and embrace a wider, more effective definition of corporate citizenship that engages them ever more directly in this sort of group project we all have of thriving into the future.
Dan?
So I think we see a business world that's increasingly aware that there's acceptable ways to be profitable and successful and unacceptable. And the acceptable way is to deliver value, not just to the business, but to society. And you do that by creating new ideas, creating wealth, creating opportunity, not by transferring wealth or imposing your costs on others. So I think there's a new principle coming that will underpin the business world and frankly be at the center of the world I work in, which is energy and environment. And it is this idea of an end to externalities. Not that there will be no more pollution, but no more pollution, no more emissions for free. Any kind of emissions, any kind of harm imposed on society will bear a charge. And I think that will be transformative because it will then reward in a structured way, self-reinforcing way, the companies that have brought sustainability to the heart of their business. And I see that coming. I think it's going to come faster than anyone imagined. I think in the next 10 years, you're going to see it as unsustainable to have a business model that has a pollution dimension to it. Aspiration, zero emissions, and expect to pay for every bit of pollution that is residual in your own business model.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank you. This has been a wonderful hour. Really enjoyed the conversation. Dave Rappaport is the Global Social Mission Officer for Ben & Jerry's. Charlotte Band is the Head of Climate Strategy at the consulting firm Qantas. And Dan Etzty is a Yale University environmental lawyer. You're listening to the second in a three-part series on global climate change. On June 15th, we'll look into how we can invest with a sustainable mindset. Environmental, social, and governance, better known as ESG, can help investors build an ethical investment strategy that delivers solid returns. This program has been produced by Kelly Gordon. And thank you very much.